I really want to thank Andy for bringing us together and for inviting me here. This is amazing. Hi, my name is Nicole Fenton, like Andy said. I work on websites and digital products, so I'm usually working right alongside engineers and designers. And today I want to talk to you about writing as a practice, as something beginners do, and how I think that relates to design. And I'm going to be a little bit more practical than I think everyone else, but I'll try to keep it broad. So earlier this year, I got really excited about this idea of the beginner's mind. I realized that all of the things that I like doing are those things where I'm just doing them because I enjoy practicing them. I'm not kind of after a particular goal or trying to one-up myself. Sorry, thirsty? So, I started kind of reading about this, and it turns out that this is actually a Buddhist concept. There's a Japanese word for it called shoshin. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. But basically, when we're beginners, we come to things playfully, and we come to them curiously, and we try different approaches. We're not afraid to ask, what some people might call stupid questions. And we take the time to really stop and notice things and kind of, smell the flowers, as you might say. So, I started reading about this, and like I said, it's a Buddhist concept. And Suzuki Roshi talks about it in his book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. He says, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's there are few. In the beginner's mind, there is no thought, I have attained something. When we have no thought of achievement, no thought of self, we are true beginners. Then we can really learn something. And I think when we're writing or designing, it's our job to be open to possibilities. If we can approach our work curiously and playfully and messily, we can peel away those layers of expertise and experience and kind of see things as they really are. Natalie Goldberg also talks about this in her book, Writing Down the Bones. This is a beautiful book if you guys want to learn more about writing, but you're not looking for a practical guide that's like, here's how to construct a sentence. This is a really great book. She says, in a sense, that beginner's mind is what we must come back to every time we sit down and write. There is no security, no assurance that because we wrote something good 2 months ago, we will do it again. Actually, every time we begin, we wonder how we ever did it before. Each time is a new journey with no maps. And I think, as designers, we can have our templates, we can have our our toolkits and our tips and tricks, but just because something worked one time doesn't mean it's going to work again. And I don't think that, having those kinds of things necessarily makes it easier for us to start the process. We really have to see each problem for what it is. So this is one of the reasons that I've started thinking of myself as a perpetual beginner. And, it gives me a license to ask those basic questions and try new things. It also takes the pressure off of me knowing everything. I don't need to be a perfectionist. I just need to be attentive, and I think that's the most important thing we can do when we're designing. So, just to tell you a little bit more about me, some of the things I mean about being a perpetual beginner right now, I'm, working on kind of more longer things. I'm a freelancer, so I'm always kind of learning about running a business, and, I'm a newlywed. So it's like, what do I want this like lifelong relationship to be? That's a totally new thing to me. I also really like to cook at home. I think that cooking and things like that, where you're working with your hands and working backwards, are really helpful for kind of design thinking. And I'm also a surfer. I always fall off my surfboard. I'm not very good, but it's really fun for me. And this is the first long talk I'm doing, so I hope you guys will be patient with me on that one today. So let's talk about writing as a practice and a way forward, and as something that beginners do. So I want to ask you guys a question. How many of you guys have tried to write something that you knew about really well or you loved, but you found it really hard to express? Yeah, so kind of everyone, right? I'm a professional writer. I've been writing, for pay for years, and I have this trouble all the time. So that's kind of one of my first points is I just want to tell you it's completely normal. And even for someone who works with words every day, like words are tricky and they're kind of crunchy and you kind of have to like chew at them. So are you guys familiar with this comic? This is Toothpaste for Dinner by Drew Fairweather. I think this captures our trouble really well. So words are how we relate to things, but even when we don't know, even when we know what we want to talk about, it doesn't really make it any easier for us to put that into words and, say what we're trying to say. And I think it can be really hard to get to the heart of something. And I think there are a lot of popular myths of writers that make this harder on us too, and especially when we're designing, make it feel like a separate activity from, the process that we're doing. So I think we come to the screen and the page with a lot of ideas about writing, but, we kind of put those ideas before what we're actually writing about. So I kind of want to, look at some of these myths, and we can laugh at them if we want. Have you guys seen Barton Fink? This is John Turturro in Barton Fink. A typical image of a writer. He's hunched over his typewriter, completely consumed with his work. He's experiencing difficulty. He's kind of breaking out into a little bit of a sweat. Maybe he hasn't had a shower in a while. And if you've seen it, he thinks he's writing about the common man and kind of, idealizing the common man, but he doesn't talk to those people. He stays locked in his room. Here's another one. This is Peggy Olson from Mad Men. Elizabeth Moss is the actress. She's she's sitting there maybe in Don's office drinking some bourbon. I think she's, she kind of looks ambitious. She's scheming maybe a little bit, looking for a big break. She's the copywriter on the team. I had to do this one for Frank, sorry. This is Snoopy, as Snoopy. All of his stories start out, it was a dark and stormy night. And even when Lucy and Linus tell him, hey, you might want to start your stories with something else than it was a dark and stormy night, that's what he always starts with. He doesn't really take feedback. He wants to be a world-famous author, and he really thinks that storytelling is everything that's important to humanity. And then one more, just because Jack Nicholson. This is Jack Torrance in The Shining, and of course, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. So, these are just some myths of writers. I think some of the things that we believe about writing really get in our way, and let's just go through these. If you want to write, you really need to know what you mean to say before you sit down. You need a plan or a thesis. You need to have some sort of outline. You shouldn't wonder or ramble. You kind of need to keep things under control. And on the other spectrum, if you think about Hemingway or any of the famous novelists, you really need to be tortured or completely addicted to something. You have to be on a bender to be able to write. Or my least favorite, which is you need to be inspired, you need a muse, you need a magical thunderbolt, and you really need it now. Right? So I think that this is bullshit. I've been writing for years, and I don't really believe any of this, and I totally empathize with people when you have these feelings. It's totally normal to have those feelings, but I think this is total bullshit. So I kind of want to talk about how I think that fits with design and break that apart. We talk about writing as if it comes from this place of knowing, a place of clarity and understanding, this place where, everything just makes sense. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I've ever been to this place. And we kind of leave out the messy parts where, we're anticipating some sort of epiphany or inspiration. But what I would propose is that writing comes from a place of not knowing, a place of wanting to understand, of seeking clarity, and kind of a messy place, a place for beginners. And So instead of thinking about writing as a way to transfer knowledge from one brain to another, what I think we should do is think about writing as a way to build understanding. I think we build that understanding first in ourselves through the process, which is very much like the design process. We think, we notice, we ask questions, we kind of jot down the things that strike us, and then we massage what we're trying to say. And then once we kind of have a basic understanding of what we're doing, we're able to share that with our audience, whether that's an internal team or our actual readers, like if we're writing a blog post or something like that, and then you're able to kind of take in feedback and work through the process. Excuse me. I think that words help us understand the world around us, and with language we can examine our ideas and try them out and discuss them. And as designers, we're familiar with this idea of taking something and working with what we know and kind of building on it over time. And if you use a jargon word, it might be like agile or iteration, but I think that is the design process, and I approach writing the same way. So when designers ask me, what does the writing process look like? I think that writing is design. I think it's a form of design, and I think that our work is interrelated and it's braided up together, and we can't separate it. When we're talking about products, we're talking about the text and the interactions and the code. Sorry. So we build these intricate systems, and they're growing and imperfect, and we're constantly kind of braiding them together with strings and colors and boxes. And I think we're quilting this web together deliberately or not. So I want to kind of talk about how I see writing as design, and then get into the broader side of that on the technology angle. So I think we have similar skills. We use critical thinking. As David was talking about, we're here to communicate. We kind of help plan and translate and organize information, whether that's helping people on the project kind of connect with each other and identify with what's the goal and that sort of thing, or helping our readers figure out where they're going in a process. And I think all of us kind of need to be able to deal with ambiguity. We think about systems, but we really care about those details. And I think we have to see a better outcome than what we have today. And David touched on that too. It's kind of our job to imagine a better future and to help our team get there. And I think writing and design share goals too. We're here to inform people. We're kind of trying to solve or reduce problems, not create more, new ones. And we really want to create lasting work. And ultimately, we're trying to make the world a better place, one little website or app at a time. And I think design and writing, we also often set a tone. We get to kind of put a feeling or a personality into whatever it is that we're building. And the process is similar too. I talked a little bit about this, but when I work with clients, I go in, ask questions, I try to figure out what are the goals, what are the constraints, and what are the people involved, who are the audiences and the stakeholders, that kind of thing. And how can we shape a system that supports those people? And then you kind of take in feedback and build on what you know over time. Thank you. Very thirsty today. So ultimately, I think we all listen, plan, compose, and revise, and our materials are intertwined in that process. So I would argue that copy is interface, and the words on your website or your app shape how people think about your products and how they use them and how they relate to them and talk about them to other people. And so every piece of copy is a piece of your design. But it pains me to say it, most designers that I've worked with rely on lorem ipsum, at least until I'm at their side, and I can't tell you how many times I've been pulled into a project and they've said, we just need you to do a little copy editing. And the design was completely broken because it was a layer of paint or just a reskin, and the redesign didn't like actually take any time to say, well, what are the problems that this current thing is, are creating, or like what are the things that we need to solve for this particular audience or internal audience. So I think if we can't be bothered to look under the surface and really think about that text and think about the little bits of the website, then we're never really going to solve any problems at all. And that's kind of how, like, why I really love what I do, is that I can come in and help the designer and the engineer really make the thing actually solve problems. So you may be wondering, what am I talking about with writing? Am I talking about ads or landing pages? Just to be super clear, I'm talking about all of the text on your website. All of the strings, all of the buttons, all of the labels, all of the names of things, the nomenclature you use. And individually, these are all bits of text. But if you add them all up, they're your voice, they're your communications, and they're going to put the feeling into your users and kind of can really affect your user experience. So I think, David and I have both talked about this. Writing and design are about communicating. Like, that's what we're here to do. And I think that the internet is a mass communications platform. Language is our most fundamental technology. And Kevin Kelly says that in his book, What Technology Wants. If you haven't read this book, it's completely changed how I think about my work, and I would really recommend it to all of you. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about it and kind of going through some crunchy little quotes because I think they're really interesting. So bear with me here. So he says, language accelerates learning and creation by permitting communication and coordination, which is a mouthful, but he says with words we can share ideas, we can talk to each other, and we can learn from each other's mistakes. And I think he also says with words we're able to make new things and to even be able to conceive of them, let alone talk about them and build them. A new idea can be spread quickly if someone can explain it and communicate it to others before they have to discover it for themselves. So I think what he's saying here is language is a shortcut. It's also a time warp. And if you think about all of the dead writers of history, it's also a sort of immortality. It's a way for us to help the people that we don't know, that don't even live yet, or that don't live in a country that speaks English, for example, to learn from what we've learned. And then the last bit is also full of interesting clauses here. But of language is not communication, but auto-generation. Language is a trick that allows the mind to question itself, a magic mirror that reveals to the mind what the mind thinks, a handle that turns the mind into a tool. With the grip on the slippery, aimless activity of self-awareness and self-reference, language can harness a mind into a fountain of new ideas. So what I think Kevin Kelly is talking about in his book is that language is how we get unstuck. And I think this is really important and exciting, not just as a writer, but for what we do as communicators. And long before the internet and the printing press, language gave us a way forward. Another fun fact from his book, he talks about the word technology and its Greek root. It comes from two words, techne and logos. And techne is a Greek word which means speech about art, skill of words, craft or craftsmanship. And it's also been translated as ingenuity. So if we think about language as our most basic technology, I think it's our responsibility to be clear and to build understanding with our readers. And that really has to start in ourselves. So one last quote from Kevin Kelly, because I'm such a fan. Every technology, no matter its origin, can be channeled toward more transparency, greater collaboration, increased flexibility, and greater openness. So I think if we're willing to accept these 4 principles, having a beginner's mind is the first step to going about that. Writing helps us overcome our limits and overcome the past. It gives us a foundation for building the future. it helps us discuss our ideas, move them around, and share them across different borders. And I think, especially with writing, we can outlive our deaths, speak to people in languages that we have never learned, and change the course of history. So, okay, where do I begin with that? As designers, I kind of want to ask you a favor to not just think about the content, but feel like you're allowed to write it, And so what I want to kind of talk about is how I've become a better writer. And I don't mean these things as advice so much as I'm going to talk about, well, this is how I write, and I hope it's useful to you in some way and encouraging to you to go out and figure out how you can write too. I think writing is a really personal act, just like reading. If you guys know Read Mail, we love the Read Mail guys. Henrik always says there's many kinds of ways to read as readers, and I think it's very similar with writers. So this is kind of why I think of writing as a personal practice, and maybe some of these things will help you out, I don't know. So the 4 things I'm going to go over: think like a designer, which should be easy for you guys because most of you are designers. Go places you've never been, start in the middle, and write the way you do. So I know there are some writers in the audience who maybe don't think of themselves as designers. And there are some designers that want to write better but don't really know where to start. One of the first things that I would say to you is to talk to each other. So if you have a writer on your project, sit with them. If you're the writer and you have a separate designer, get to know each other, talk about your process, really become partners in this project. And I'm always surprised when I hear people talk about how the engineering team's over there and the content team's over there and the design team's over there. I really believe we should all be like this and figuring the thing out together. I think the most important thing to think about when you're working on interface content or writing is that you're working with a system. And the system needs to support the needs of its users or its readers. And we have to work through each little implication of each decision that we're making. And I don't think that that's unusual for designers to think about, but that applies to the text as well. When we can look at our writing as a communication system, we can begin to understand why we need to be a little bit more flexible in our approach. And I think we can kind of see why we need to approach writing a little differently. As designers, we always try to make the best thing that we can with the time and materials that we have. And I think we know that that can build up and change over time. But for some reason, that thinking doesn't always apply to writing. But I think our writing should have that same flexibility and fluidity. We shouldn't talk about things as if they're final. I get really irritated when people use the word post-mortem because they just put something into the world and they talk about it like it's dead. But all of our work relies on us. We have to nurture it over time. And I think for me, I'm a freelancer. If you're working as a freelancer, it's kind of your job to help your client understand how to nurture their own product over time as well. So, I said this earlier, but I'm a surfer, and I really like this fluidity metaphor. Whenever we talk about the web as moving content or, water, I get really excited. But I think this is a good approach to think about your writing and, embrace that kind of shifting, chatty nature of the web when you're writing for your products. I think we can start small and really build from there. And maybe have a little paragraph and later it becomes a whole long article. It doesn't need to be everything all at once. And I think the writing is never fixed. It's never final, and it can evolve just as your design does. So the first thing that I think has really made me a better writer is nothing to do with the internet at all. When I was 14, I lived in a really lame suburb of Texas where there's really nothing to do. And I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I kind of I wanted to do something more with my time. So I decided to start studying photography, and it's a totally unrelated field. And I took a course at a junior college, and I managed to get in. I had to take this test to prove I could go to a junior college art class when I was 14. But I managed to get a great teacher, and he showed me Cartier-Bresson and Stieglitz and Robert Mapplethorpe and all these things that a 14-year-old girl doesn't normally look at. But my favorite photographer at the time was Diane Arbus, and this is her in Central Park with her camera. She liked to take photos of freaks and nudists and kids, in the park, and kind of people on the fringes of society. And I got so excited about her that I bought my first art book. I got her monograph, and in the front it says something that I think about every day. She says, my favorite thing is to go where I've never been. If I were just curious, it would be hard to say to someone, I want to come to your house and have you talk to me and tell me the story of your life. I mean, they're going to say, you're just crazy, right? Plus, they're going to keep mighty guarded, but the camera is a kind of license. So, she's talking about using the camera as a way to get in. And I think photo walks are a really great way to do beginner's mind physically, in your body, and go and look at things that maybe you didn't notice on your normal walk to work. Even in my 20s, I used to go and take my camera and go into these abandoned buildings and kind of, it's sketchy and you never know what you're gonna find, but it's one way to kind of get into this mindset of going places you've never been. And I think that writing is a license too. It's an excuse to kind of ask those questions or wedge into a conversation, be a little nosy. And you can try on different styles. You can kind of ask people things without creeping them out. And I think you can really kind of eliminate those dark corners for your readers and use your curiosity for good. So to work with this premise, one of the things I had to realize is that everything is connected. And we hear that phrase, and it seems kind of empty, but I think if you really kind of take that deep into your bones, you realize that all of these things we're doing are interlaced together. And I think one of the ways to figure out something over here is to actually learn about something completely different. And that sounds crazy, but it's completely worked for me. And so you may be wondering, am I talking about waterfall? Am I talking about kind of doing a bunch of research before you even start writing or designing? And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm really just talking about kind of feeding your curiosity. So the next thing is that I start in the middle. I don't try to write the beginning of something. If I'm starting on a landing page, I don't try to start with the very top of the landing page. That is the hardest part to write generally, is the beginning. So I start in the middle of what I'm trying to write and kind of work my way out. So that's kind of what I was saying about building on what I know. I'll be jotting down notes the whole time I'm in the process and kind of build on those layer by layer. I used to try to write the beginning, and I would try to organize all of the ideas that I wanted to say and get them in order before I even really wrote a long thing. And that doesn't really give me room to change my mind, which is something that is really important for us to be able to change our minds. So now I start in the middle, and I think that if you have a whiteboard, if you're a whiteboard person, that's super helpful. I just use pen and paper. You don't need any fancy tools to be a writer, which is awesome. And then I kind of build out what I'm writing and start showing it to people. And I think if you can find a group of beta readers, whether those are two of your friends who are not designers or your client or whoever it is, start showing people things early, because it's really the conversations you're having about the writing that are important, not just what you know. So I think writing can be a research tool and kind of a point for conversation. And that's kind of how I cook too. It's working backwards or building on what you know. Kind of starting here and figuring out as you go, instead of being I'm trying to get over there. If you have any interest in learning about this kind of mindset Another thing that's unrelated to design is cooking. There's this beautiful book by Tamar Adler. She's an American writer who used to work at Chez Panisse in California. And she says, instinct, whether on the ground or in the kitchen, is not a destination, but a path. The word instinct comes from a combination of in, meaning toward, and stinger, meaning to prick. It doesn't mean knowing anything, but pricking your way toward the answer. And this is how I write. You know, it's funny to use the verb prick, but really, like, make it up and go from there. I think these exercises of kind of like being okay with not knowing, but wanting to figure it out. Like, it's like flexing a muscle. And, you know, these exercises can take many forms. So sometimes I do like a little Mad Libs-y kind of thing with my client. Sometimes I make a little bit of a sketchy outline and just kind of stretch it from there. But really, like I said, it's kind of about getting people involved in the conversation. So here's a little example of something that I did for a recent client, Safari Flow. They make an app for people who build websites that can learn about, you know, the web. And it's basically a reading app. So, you know, just initially, I asked a very basic question. They kept calling the books the best books. Well, why are these the best books? Like, let's actually break that apart. Like, what are the words that make these the best? And what is this thing? Is it a service? Is it a product? Is it a tool? Is it a platform? It's not a platform, but, you know, like, just trying to get everyone on the same page, actually designing each word that we use to talk about the thing. And then, you know, this is literally like just a short little thing. Why does it help me? You know, every product, like, you know, you can't have like everything to everyone. So you need to pick like a couple of benefits to each thing that you're working on, whether it's a little like product tour of like, hey, we just, you know, added this new thing and it's great because blah. You know, you kind of have to narrow things down for people. But I think what's important, and why I wanted to show you this, is that the pieces that have to be crisp and clear come from a very messy place. They don't come from, you know, a fancy place or a templated place. They come from just like notes. You know, they just come from me writing down something. And I think that, you know, you guys can do this too. So I would say design the words so they can change as your mind does. Like, think about those things on the page, whether you're working with, you know, a basic like replacement for Ipsum, or you're just starting to kind of put headers. Like, think about them in a way so that you can change them quickly as your mind does. And use little layered chunks, like especially for a landing page, if you're doing marketing or something, like use chunks that you can move around. And just realize that each piece of writing is like a wall of bricks, and you can pull bricks out. You can rearrange them. Like, nothing needs to stay. If it's not working, take it out. You know, feel like you can manipulate the words just as you do your pixels. Sometimes I also show clients other websites, and I know this is totally common in a visual design exercise, like just to figure out what you're talking about. I think writing is ultimately about helping people understand things and shaping the feeling and showing people the way. So we kind of do the same thing, we just use different materials. The last thing I want to talk about is writing the way you do. This phrase comes from a lovely book by a guy whose name I have a hard time saying. It's Verlin Klinkenborg. It just rolls off the tongue. It's called Several Short Sentences on Writing, and it's another that I would recommend if you actually want to learn to write better. It's really great. And it's full of advice, stuff that, you know, I never thought about. He says, part of the struggle in learning to write is learning to ignore what isn't useful to you and pay attention to what is. This is a book full of starting points. Perhaps they'll help you find enough clarity in your own mind and your own writing to discover what it means to write. I mean write the way I do, or write the way they do. I mean write the way you do. And I think that's really, really important. When you're designing, you probably don't think like, how can I design like so-and-so, right? You're like, how can I solve this problem? And when you're writing, you don't need to sound like anyone else. You know, we come to writing with all this teaching from school, like you need to make arguments and your sentences should be long and you always need a thesis. I think it's nonsense, and I think you can have really short sentences like Fairland talks about, and you can really just kind of say what you know and work on that. So this is a place where the beginner's mind can be really useful. There's a lot of advice about writing out there, but I tend to think of it as a personal practice and as something that's very, it's something that you can play with and kind of try on different styles and see what works for you. So most of this is conceptual, and I just kind of want to end on some things that I actually do as a writer, and maybe it'll be useful to you. It doesn't matter what time of day it is for me. It doesn't matter where I am. It doesn't even really matter like what kind of machine or paper I have. Like, I don't really care about that. For me, I really need to write as much as I can and just kind of keep practicing it the way that if you're a swimmer, you practice swimming. If you're a designer, you practice design. If you like reading, you keep reading. Sometimes I write on paper, on the screen, and I don't really care about the tools. I do use editorially, and I love iWriter when I'm offline. You saw me doing some sketchy notes in iWriter there. It's not really about where I am or when I am or even how I'm feeling. The first thing I have to remember when I'm writing is that it's hard and that I can do it. And that seems crazy, as someone who's been doing this for years, I just have to, every single time I sit down, tell myself, this is going to be hard, but it's rewarding. And also, just keep your butt in the chair. And I'm sure you guys are, familiar with this idea. You can call it determination. You can call it focus. For me, it's actually literally just, oh my God, how long am I going to sit in this chair until I figure this out? And I just have to keep sitting there and writing. And when I get stuck, I can go and ask questions. So I guess my biggest point of advice when people are like, how do I become a better writer? Just keep trying, don't give up. I think writing is work, just like everything we do, but it's really worthwhile to practice. And then lastly, it took me years to stop trying to sound like an academic, some blogger that I like, my favorite poets, my favorite musicians. We try on these different styles, kind of like clothes that don't really quite fit. And if I could give you another piece of advice, it would be to write with your own voice. And if you don't know what that means, record yourself. Talk, it's really embarrassing if people are around, but use Siri or use your computer, whatever you need. Listen to what you sound like and argue through something on your phone or whatever it is that you want to use. And you should really sound like you when you're writing. You don't need to sound like a business person or a lawyer or an academic. And that's really hard for a lot of people because, I think when we sit down to write a business email or something, we feel like we need to be super professional and clear. But I think a lot of the jargon and stuff we use in the business world gets in the way. So use your voice and write what you notice. What you notice is your material. And for me, I like to look at random things, like I said, when I'm going on a photo walk, and I kind of find that stuff to remind me to, just trust the things that I'm noticing are worth noticing. The other way you can kind of sound like you is just imagine someone you love sitting there at your table. I'm a cook, I like to serve food at my table at home. Imagine them sitting across from you and you're telling them whatever it is you're saying. And if that's a little hard, maybe write them a letter if they're on the other side of the country or on the other side of the continent. Write them a letter and just see them there in your mind. And you probably won't sound so stiff. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you find a place to begin. Read books and edited text. Write your heart out. Find your beta readers, whoever those are, their friends or family, and be kind to each other. There is no secret. Thank you.